You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. I'm your host, here to take you through into areas of deep interest, deep questioning, and deep doubt about some topics, especially in psychology, but also in terms of sociology, history, philosophy, all the allied sort of fields that we have that make and reflect up our humanity. So, in the last few episodes, I've been taking a deep dive into ADD, ADHD, to help people think a little bit more deeply and broadly about the topic. Now, I was going to leave it today, and I was just going to start with a new topic, that of masculinity and all its permutations, and some really serious questions about how it is that we understand men, masculinity, and all the other stuff that goes with it. But I wanted to start this episode off after I heard an interesting report on ABC Radio National about the explosion of prescriptions for ADD, ADHD, and, how we have a tendency to be served up, the wonderful impact on how the medication has changed people's lives, but we don't necessarily get a good insight when the whole thing goes wrong. And I thought I'd share that with you because there were a couple of things that stood out for me that I think I need to address after the last few episodes. Firstly, this was about a woman who, for whatever reasons, had started to think about the fact that she may have ADHD. And so, like a lot of us these days, when we start questioning anything, we go to Google, and in this instance, it was Dr. Google. And so, she started looking and researching on the net, and then her partner was giving her various bits of feedback that made her think more and more and more, no, I need to go and get an assessment done and see if I have this diagnosis. And again, what she did was she went to Dr. Google, and as the report states, she entered ADHD clinic into the search field and basically chose a clinic that could give her an appointment within the month or around a month's time. And she did that. And from it, she received the diagnosis. Yes, she had ADD, ADHD. And she was prescribed, as far as I know, Ritalin. Now, my first warning bell is the whole trip down the Dr. Google number. That, to me, is always a little bit problematic. Now, sometimes it can be helpful, okay? But it requires the confirmation of a professional, right? So all of those of you who are thinking about this, because there is so much material, and lots of people, especially in midlife now, are starting to talk about, maybe I got it. I've got certain characteristics, certain behaviours that fall into this. First stop is please talk to your GP. I think that's the very first stop. The second bit that really concerned me was that the assessment was done over the internet. In other words, something like telehealth. Now, as a psychologist and as a psychotherapist, I personally don't do assessments on telehealth, Zoom, FaceTime, whatever. I want to see the person face to face. And there's lots of reasons for that. And despite what even some professional bodies say that I personally don't believe you can get a really good, clear insight into a person unless you see them face to face. There are a whole lot of non-verbal behaviours that come with seeing someone in person that we don't get over a screen. And I can go into depth with this. And Dr. Mark Williams, a neuroscientist, a friend of mine and a colleague, we've had this discussion before and we're in agreement. That something that is as interpersonally sensitive as a psychological assessment, as a, and trying to do a differential diagnosis, we personally believe that needs to be done face to face. I tend to think that's probably important with medical assessments as well, although once that's been established, quite often follow-ups can be done over telehealth or FaceTime or Zoom or whatever the platform is. And so there are instances where I assess someone face-to-face, but we'll have subsequent sessions over FaceTime or Zoom. And it depends exactly on what the problem is. And, I also do some coaching. So coaching to me over the internet's not so much of a problem, but psychotherapy, that's a face-to-face gig. Okay, so let me stress that. Now, her life, from the moment she started taking the medication, which, as I said, my understanding was that was Ritalin, disintegrated over time. And it is my understanding that what eventually emerged was that she had previous mental health issues that she either didn't disclose or that didn't come up in the assessment. And so she essentially had a very powerful manic episode, manic psychosis. And, again, this is one of my concerns about how this field has exploded around a particular diagnosis, which is often plagued by confirmation bias and by, any sort of a number of, cognitive biases that can come into play. Just because someone says you have this particular behaviour doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. And so I do think that we need to be really, really careful. And so here is the thing that I want everybody to take out of this. If you have concerns about whether you have, especially something like ADD, ADHD, do not go down the route of simply diagnosing yourself through the internet or going to, an online clinic. That, to me, doesn't seem very appropriate. And, I'm not sure how many people have had significant adverse reactions to the medications or whether that's tripped something off. But I think we need to be cautious. We do need to be very, very cautious about this. And it goes for all sorts of psychopharmaceuticals. They're powerful drugs. And, we need to be very clear about engaging and how we engage with help and support on this. And simply customer demand is not a good principle in terms of managing this problem, either psychologically or, more importantly, socially in a way. All right. Any questions? You can either come back to me with my contact details, or please speak with your health professionals, especially your GP, about this. I've got a special announcement about how you can work with me. Since starting this podcast, I've had a lot of inquiries from listeners asking how they can work with me on a one-to-one basis. Now, I've finally managed to free up some time to work with about 5 clients privately. Typically, we'll work together for 6 months, applying the ideas I discuss here to help you lead a fulfilled, meaningful, and happy life, and a well-rounded life. If that's something you'd be interested in, drop me an email at gunter@goodmengreat.com and we'll be in touch. Okay, so let me start the new series. And this particular series is all about men, masculinity, and anything associated to it. Now, recently we had the International Men's Day, and we also had the White Ribbon Day here in Australia. And so, there's a whole bunch of things that have come together that made me go, probably a really good idea to start talking about this. And, a large part of my podcast is fundamentally about boys to men, good to great, and really understanding this area well. I tend to think that, it's been either a very academic endeavour and exercise, or it's just been bandied about with a whole bunch of opinions ranging from, the excellent to the absolutely absurd. And I continue to get teenage boys almost radicalised by the likes of Andrew Tate, where they've taken on this reactionary idea about how to be a man and what that means to be a man. And I don't think that these boys are actually going to end up in a very healthy psychological state, or sometimes even a physical state. I mean, when I look at boys, 15, 16 going to the gym and they're pumping themselves up with, pre-workout formulas, high-protein formulas, post-workout formulas. Apart from anything else, they cost an absolute arm and a leg. And I've got to ask the question about, is it really healthy? And then when they're older, a lot of them are beginning to access various other formulas. They're basically to enhance their bulk, but not necessarily their health. Yes, we often talk about, steroids and all the sort of illegal substances that go on in that scene. But I think we also need to be somewhat cautious about what it is that our kids getting into with regard to supplements and all that sort of stuff. It's not an easy area. So one of the things that I thought I'd start off with, and in today's podcast, we're really probably going to get a little ways through it, was the whole idea about, the abundance of myths and opinions about men and masculinity. What does it really mean? So I want to cover a number of areas, and essentially the first cab off the rank for me is basically myth busting. And I like a little bit of myth busting. It's like in all things science, it's good to sort of bust a few myths, create some doubt. Let's not jump onto bandwagons immediately, but rather give ourselves some, information that we can turn into knowledge and that we can apply wisely. Remember my podcast on wisdom, and I'm going to continue with that theme throughout all my podcasts, because we, in our culture now, definitely have a bucket load of information at hand, some of which is knowledge. But the question is, are we applying this wisely? And again, particularly in the human sphere, we've got some echo chambers now that are particularly toxic. And remember, I'm not saying that there is a thing as toxic masculinity, but there is patriarchy, which happens to result in toxic behaviour a lot of the time. So one of the things, that came up with White Ribbon Day was I got sort of, tapped on the shoulder and gone, yeah, well, what about women killing their partners, men? Women kill men as well. And my response was to give the person a whole bunch of statistics to show how that's disproportionate to the number of women. In Australia, we have one woman every 10 days who's killed in an intimate partner relationship. But there is a whole host of other things that go with it. Emotional abuse. It's not just physical abuse. It's just not homicide. It's a whole range of behaviours that are exceptionally detrimental and hurtful and damaging to a person. And yeah, I agree. I mean, I deal with a whole bunch of boys and men who are in relationships with women where the women's behaviour is inappropriate and at times, is expressed as an expression of this psychological disorder rather than as a well-adjusted human being. But we don't teach boys especially about what's okay and what's not okay in someone else's behaviour, especially if that person becomes their girlfriend. That label seems to have an added buffer to understanding what behaviour is okay and what's not. So a lot of the guys that I work with put up with a lot of bad behaviour from their intimate partners. And so, the result is that they're psychologically disturbed and distressed, and ultimately can develop a psychological disorder like PTSD. So in this particular episode, it's just a little bit of foreshadowing, a little bit of, laying the scene for what it is that we understand about masculinity. And it's more complicated than what we think, because we also have the issue about the difference between sex and gender and how we articulate that. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into this at the moment. I'm basically going to stick with masculinity, with maleness as a sex, and then how we understand that that's expressed traditionally, historically, and how it can be expressed in the future, and what sort of changes that we need to make. Okay, so some of the topics that I'm going to be talking about is like, the emotional expressiveness or not expressiveness of men and how we get to that. I'm going to talk about the issue of physical strength and aggression, looking at the roles that we as males often take on in our society, and what those roles imply, and how that's expressed and what's okay and what's not okay. We have some strong taboos about the areas of masculinities, and I'm a strong believer that there ain't one size that fits all, that there is a spectrum of how we express that. And a lot of our sort of attitudes and beliefs and opinions about this are outdated. They are akin to the, intellectual dinosaurs. The other thing I want to talk about too is the idea of success and masculinity. What is it that we mean by this, right? And so, we need to start thinking outside of the box with this, because the messages that we're giving to boys and girls in this sphere often sends them into an anxious spin, because they frequently don't feel that they can step into that space with confidence and with a sense of self-worth. Okay? So what happens that is that a lot of people get themselves into difficulty. Their, sort of mask of confidence that's not matched by their competence can often be seriously problematic in the workplace. The other thing I'm going to talk about is that whole notion of male solitude and independence. And I think that that's a really, really important topic, because from my personal experience, I'm fairly outgoing in many respects, and I like people, and I like being around people, and I certainly like having good chats and, some serious, robust conversation about all sorts of stuff. But the balance is that I also need privacy, and I also need solitude, wherein I sort of, contemplate my ideas and my own opinions, and I test them, because self-reflection is really, really important, but reflection on ideas is equally important. I don't want to, in a day and age where we constantly get thrown material at us, I don't want to end up being, stuck with some ideas that actually have no functionality, or what's more important or worse is no validity. And I can go to all sorts of different areas within, the human sciences where we have some seriously outdated ideas. And those ideas are often, propagated within important areas like education, leadership, like corporate governance, like how we manage the economy and what the economy is really about. It's also relevant to politics. So it's a very, very important area wherein it's really time that we need to start gathering the information, shape it into knowledge, so that we can make wise decisions that are in the best interest of not just ourselves, but the community as a whole. Because ultimately, if we don't do this, folks, we are going to head towards our own extinction. We are the masters of our own demise, ultimately, if we are not careful. And some people believe that we're way beyond the tipping point. We're into it. It's just a matter of time before we go kaput. And sometimes looking at the media, the news media, I sort of go, yeah, the hallmark's there. Now, on the flip side, the planet's doing some weird and wonderful things in some respects, which seems to indicate that it's a bit sick and tired of us. I know I'm anthropomorphizing, but hey, it's my podcast and I'll take that prerogative. So hopefully you're going to join me on this deep dive over the next series of podcasts about men, masculinity, and all things that it impacts, because I'm really after a very robust examination. What is patriarchy? What is maleness, masculinity? What is, ideas like character, virtue, morality within that sphere? I mean, we're seeing things done by men today that are absolutely horrendous and deserve criticism and rejection. But, we have a system that somehow seems to support these people in their craziness. And I think that that's very, very dangerous. We've been there before in the 20th century. Do we want to go back to it? I find it ironic that it was in the 1920s, that society started rumbling with ultra-right-wing ideas, fascist ideas. And by 1938, we were steeped in a world conflict. Are we going to repeat this in the 100-year gap, and we're going to do this shit again? I certainly hope we won't. And on that note, please join me next time. All those who are part of the program, let me welcome you back. Let me welcome you back for the next series as well. And until next time, this is me signing off. And be inspired, be inspiring, and think critically. Have doubts about stuff that you hear. Don't just swallow it whole, because you might throw up. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.guntersvoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at noirtainment.com.